Matthew. And as we were getting started, I was giving special thanks to Jesse for the question he had, which led me to read some really interesting research that I'm going to share with you. And also Claire, who posted some samples. If you've posted them in the last half hour, I missed it, but I'll certainly go back and look at them. But I'm so happy to have some context that we can talk about. So today I'm hoping that we can talk together about some things that we've initiated in prior sessions, teachbacks, and this was a question that Jesse had, so I've done a little more research on that, and also the readings and the samples. And then in terms of new information, I'm really lucky Rich wrote the chapter on immersive virtual reality, so I'm going to summarize what he has to say about that. And he also updated the chapter on digital games for learning. So, and then we're just kind of do a summary at the end, what has been useful for you out of a lot of the stuff we've looked at. That's sort of our plan for today. I have a medical appointment shortly after this, so I'm not going to be able to stay after. Matthew, I don't know if you can stay after just to, have additional discussion. That was a question.
Will do.
He's giving a thumbs up, so.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I was looking at my slide.
Yeah.
Okay. So last time we had talked about teachbacks, and in particular, non-interactive teaching. And so Jesse brought up was there a comparison? I mean, to me, it's very logical. You would compare a group that's actually teaching a real audience versus a non-interactive teaching where you're just recording and see what was better. So to follow up, I thought there'd be a lot of studies on this. So there was only one that I found. But I went to this review, which is very recent, as you see, 2022. So this is about non-interactive teaching. And he had this really nice model that I'm not going to take a lot of time to go into, but I've circled the variables at the top bar that he talked about in terms of what makes non-interactive teaching more effective. So one has to do with induced social presence. And somebody last time, remind me who it was. Somebody was talking about psychological safety. Who was that? I don't know if they're here. Anybody remember?
Wasn't it Sophie? Maybe?
I don't think it was Sophie.
Oh.
Anyway, he was talking about psychological safety. And actually what the research found was this teaching is teachbacks are more effective. It's kind of a curve like this. If you just have a small group, that's good. But if you have a great big group, it's too much stress. You need enough like stress, awareness to bring up your mental and your psychological processes, but not overwhelm you. So they're basically saying go for middle of the road. Regarding timing, they said most of the research, people study a whole lesson and then they do a teaching, but it's actually better if you chunk the lesson down into sections and then people read that section. This is basically, spaced practice. You read that section, then you do your teach back. Then you go to another section, you do your teach back. So breaking it out into chunks. And they also compared if you do a teach back orally, verbally, or if you do it in writing, and verbally gave better results. So that is going back to the non-interactive teaching. But I went back to this guy's paper because I wanted to answer Jesse's question about, would it be good if you had somebody teaching, but to a chat bot? And you guys know way more about this than I do. And that would maybe ask questions. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. So this article was published in 2008. I'll be happy to send the reference to anybody who wants to look at it, but I love this research. So first of all, let's look at the results at the top. They compared two groups. One was peer tutoring, so it was one-on-one. One person is tutoring a tutee. Then they had another one where there was no audience. They just did a video recording of their teaching, which would be what we'd call the non-interactive teaching. And then a third group did self-explaining. So Chi was the one who actually discovered and talked about the self-explaining research. So look at those results. So what was shocking here, that the self-explaining group actually was better than either the peer tutoring or the video recording group. But here's what was interesting. In addition to, measuring knowledge, this is what you see in black, they also recorded all these conversations. In the self-explainers, they talked aloud. They recorded them and then they categorized their statements. So that's what they call a process analysis. And what they found is both the peer tutoring and the video recording group, basically they engaged in knowledge telling, which was a kind of a repetition of the content. But the self-explainers actually dug in deeper. They had more inferences and they weren't in this knowledge telling mode. So it was a question of, what they were actually doing. The other interesting thing is for the peer tutoring group, they asked the tuties, the ones that were being tutored, to ask questions. And they analyzed the questions, and the ones that asked deeper level questions actually then prompted deeper level responses from the tutors. So this goes back to Jesse's thought, and you guys know more about these chatbots than I do, but you could have somebody teaching to some little on-screen thing that would then ask you questions that are deeper level questions, which would then promote and prompt deeper level processing by the tutor. So what do you guys have to say about chatbots and what's going on? And is this a feasible idea?
Well, first off, thank you, Ruth, for diving into this because, yeah, it was very pertinent. And I know there is a bit of a movement to be utilizing some of this technology. In terms of the numbers here, maybe perhaps I missed it and was zoned out on something, but the numbers here, so is this retention rates on key material?
It was an application test.
Okay, so
and I didn't post up the statistics, but they found that the self-explaining group, that was their score. I don't know if that's the percentage or a score out
okay.
of so many, but it was significantly better than the other two, which were, as you can see, pretty close to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So the learning was better in the self-explanation group because they processed, more deeply. And then among the ones in the video recording, if in the peer tutoring, if they had questions that were deep level questions, they got out of that knowledge telling mode and learned more.
Ruth, I have a question. I'm curious with the self-explaining piece.
Yeah.
Did they give people instruction on how to do that well? Or did they just say like, take time and explain what is happening? Because I feel like that, like if we were to put that in an e-learning, people tend to just skip over it or do it really like rudimentary. So I'm curious how they introduced it to get this type of result.
Yeah, that's really good, Julie. So and I think that's a real important issue. In this case, it was an experiment. And so I don't think they gave them particular training, but they just asked them to read through the material and then write down their own thoughts and explanations as they were going along. But I think if you were, actually doing this, you would provide maybe an example and give people more structure than they did. There's a whole literature on self-explaining. So anybody's interested, and I wanted to say it today, I have to leave for a medical appointment, but my email is on each of these slides. So feel free any point to email with additional questions or points. Anyway, I think a really exciting future research, which Jesse can initiate, is to take some of these, have these online little bot things that would ask you questions as you're tutoring. I have no idea about the technology. Does anybody?
Having worked with some of our tech team, they're able to program it. It's all kind of based on an algorithm. So it's usually based on FAQs currently. So frequently asked questions get prompted, and here's our prompting answer. So it is very simple. If this question gets percolated, then here's the response for it, and here's additional resources. However, if we're trying to do it and mimic questions from a participant or learning group, it might be a little bit harder to do because it has to be in context to the words being shared. So if I go off and use self-explaining to summarize something that I've just learned and explain it in my own words, the bot's just literally going to be looking for those exact words and prompts. So it might not match and actually add more confusion. That's just what the technology I'm comfortable in. However, I've been just kind of, following how this technology is advancing, and we're starting to see some major, almost scary advancements with some of this. So in terms of artificial intelligence and what it's capable of. So for me, it's just kind of what's the next 10 years going to look like and what are we capable of? So
Scary. Yeah. Well, I would think even using the methodology you mentioned, if you taught this, say, in an in-person or online group, and then people ask questions, you could, get those questions together and use that as the basis of, your chat bot, and you'd pick the deeper level questions, not the shallow question. I agree with you. It's going to be exciting to see what happens here. Okay, the reading. So we just kind of skipped over this last time. I thought Rich Mayer did a really nice job. He's got a lot of information in there. It's very succinct. And I wanted to see if any comments anybody had. These were just a few of the questions I had. He makes a point, just because you can do something with technology doesn't mean it should be done. And also there's been a long evolution of media comparison. I think the first one was done, I don't know, in the 1920s or 30s. It had to do with film. Film was the hot new technology, and the Army had said, well, we don't really need to have live instructors. We could replace them with films. So they did, but they tested it first, film versus a live instructor, et cetera. And what they've generally found in these media comparisons is, it's not a question so much of the medium, but of how well it's used. And most of them, we got so excited, educational television is going to revolutionize everything. And then, the early computer-based learning is going to, and mostly it's been kind of disappointing, the results. And he also makes a good point at the end about rote versus meaningful methods of instruction. So I'm just putting those all out there to see if anybody had any general reactions or any comments to any of these questions.
I'll share. So like for the first point, just because something can be done doesn't mean it should be done. So there was, I used to work at a university, and I think in our medical school, they actually did some research and studied using like more realistic bodies to practice some sort of operating procedure on versus like a rudimentary one. And what they found was the rudimentary sort of body actually got like helped people learn the whatever medical surgery procedure they were doing. And so they actually were able to say, we don't need to spend as much money on all of these like fancy things, and we're actually helping people do better. So I thought that's just one of the things that kind of comes to mind as I think about like technology can be fancy, but it doesn't always lead to the best results.
I think we may have lost Ruth momentarily there, Julie, but I completely agree with you from what I've seen throughout my career. Is quite often we get wrapped up with new tools and all the new fancy bells and whistles, and look at what we could do with slides and video, but in doing all of it, it just becomes a distraction. I'm more interested in all this fancy stuff opposed to what I'm actually there to do, which is transfer things into my long-term memory and be able to apply those things and increase my performance or change behavior. So I 100% agree with you that sometimes I just like keeping things simple. I don't know what other people's thoughts are.
But I think there's a trick, right? Which is managing stakeholder expectations on new and shiny.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't look new, if it doesn't taste new, if it doesn't show the coolest font and the best cartoony, entertaining graphics, they're not going to invest in it. So what are we measuring? And I think that's part of the challenge, because we measure learning, or I hope we do, but our stakeholders, they're less concerned sometimes about that. By the way, I'm trying to reach her. I'm not sure what happened, so we will figure it out in a second. But what are some of your reactions to that?
Well, just building on that, Matt, actually, it's as I reflect on my particular career in L&D, managing stakeholder expectations has probably been the biggest challenge, not learning or not putting things together in terms of instructional design. It is trying to manage the expectations of our given stakeholders of the organization I'm supporting. And quite often there's a misalignment, and
Right.
focusing on that and supporting that and trying to be persuasive and say, well, actually, no. But at the same time, maintain, a paycheck is the balance that I'm always trying to keep. And I'm curious if everybody else is still feeling that, or what your experience has been.
I think
That's
there's a
right.
confusion that happens where people think you need to do something different or cutting edge to get people interested, rather than what you're actually talking about and doing for people, getting them interested. It's like the technology replaces the substance sometimes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm back. Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Thank you, Matt, for whatever filling in you did.
It
And
was all Jesse.
Oh, well,
Jesse.
good. Thank you, Jesse. So I'm sorry I missed that discussion. This is the fun of technology, isn't it? So hopefully you had a good discussion there, because I wanted to talk about this experiment, which was our second, maybe not read in detail, but to take a look at this experiment. So could you raise your hand again? I'm just looking and I don't see everybody's video on here either. Okay, so any comments or thoughts about, I thought it would just be kind of cool, since this is evidence-based training, to actually look at a sample experiment. I thought this experiment overall had a lot of strengths and also had a couple of weaknesses. Well, one obvious weakness, which they couldn't control, this shows you how, contiguity was so violated, because it was hard to follow this, to look at the visuals, the text, and the results and tables. So, but that's just the way, that's the limits, I think, of media, especially paper media. So any comments about this experiment in general before we look at some of the details? Well, there were several things I liked about it. First of all, it was random assignment to these different groups. So it followed an experimental, the experimental path. And the focus was on agents and what agents do that's effective or not effective. So I just summarized here, and this is actually what I physically did on the paper itself. I just got the numbers out of the table and wrote them next to the treatments, which were all on different pages. So what we could see from this first experiment was that the version with the agent, the topic again was synaptic transmission. I don't read Chinese, so can't tell you the details, but it doesn't really matter. If you had the agent, learning was better than when you didn't have the agent. And what I really liked is that they also looked at eye tracking. So in this example, they were measuring what proportion of time people were looking at the agent compared to the actual content. Because the question is, was the agent distracting? And this is the eye tracking graph. The red shows where people were looking at the agent, and the green shows where they were actually looking at the content. If you look like right to the left, when they first started, you can see the red line goes way up. So people were looking at the agent, but then after that, they really weren't. And so I think our conclusion is the agent really does not distract from the content. Then they did this study where they compared, first of all, agent versus no agent. And they found generally having an agent gave better results than not. How the learner got used to, yes, and that's a good point. So it's interesting over time. I don't know how long this experiment lasted. Over time, it was effective, but then even maybe with more time, the agent, would get less interesting. But at least we can see here that the agent versions were more effective. And then we could see from this result, this compared signaling to no signaling. And having signaling, which in the left column, gave better results, which is not surprising, than no signaling. And then this I thought was just really good, where we looked at all four. And what we see is the agent who signals, so the agent that's doing something, is more effective than just having, an image there, not doing anything, or even just a signal without the agent. And then in this third experiment, I thought, well, this was really clever. They used red, so we had double signaling. In the one in the upper left, we had double signaling, and we see that really didn't do that much good. It was better just to have, the agent doing the signaling was the best result. So any comment, for one thing, this helps me appreciate, to do this experiment was a lot of work, and it makes me appreciate how much work researchers expend, putting this together. So any comments on this experiment or experiments in general? Well, you can feel sorry for me, I guess, because I go through a lot of these experiments, but this one I thought was extremely effective. Okay, Claire. Claire was kind enough to post 2 samples. And Claire, if you would take the audio, you could just give us the background, a little bit about what this is about and who it was for, etc.
All right, so our company creates 3D scanners and has the software that goes with it. So this is an extract of the software training, which is aimed at our employees, distributors, and customers as well. It was not created by a training designer, FYI. If you are one, we are looking for one to get this better. But by our SMEs. So they are such experts that they want to put everything in the training to a point that it's just this massive course. And they tend to think that more is better, which we know it is not necessarily true. So the issue that I had with most of our slides when I started working there was that we had that kind of visual where the actual visual of what you will see in your daily tasks, which are on the right here, is so small and hardly visible and hardly readable. And instead of using these images and integrating cues in there to link what you will see when you actually work in the software with what it does, is completely separated and added as a text, which is what I don't like here is that you have to go from left to right, or you completely bypass the image, which is counterproductive for daily usage of the software.
Thank you, Claire. And this is a little quiz question for everybody. What Claire just described is exactly right. Which principle does that violate? You can use your chat, put your answer in. This is not for Claire, this is for everybody. Which principle was violated based on what Claire just said? Good job, Heather. Yes. So that's the contiguity principle. And yes, which is similar, same idea of split attention. Absolutely right. So as Claire is saying, we can see the actual software is on the right. Claire, I know you mentioned the audience. Are they English speakers pretty much?
It varies. Like we publish the English version first so that everybody worldwide can access it, but then we translate it. So it's mostly English speaking, but we do have some people from all over the world that will review it as well.
And was there any audio with it, or is it just text?
For this slide, it was just what you see right there.
Okay. So, and as you said, this was the subject matter experts that put this together without the benefit of instructional design expertise, right, Claire?
That's right.
Right. So let's have some suggestions from other people. What would be some things that you might do to change this particular slide?
I would do a screen for each of the screen captures and insert labels. Make it full screen, close to full screen, and insert labels that define the different settings, menu items, choices that you could make.
Right, that should help resolve contiguity. Anything else that people would suggest? So Claire, one question I have for you, it's really about the content. So they're obviously, focusing in on this particular screen. Would these different, sometimes I wonder when we teach software, if we teach these concepts out of context of how you're going to use them. So I'd like you to comment because you know the content better, way better.
Absolutely, and that was something I was hoping was going to pop up. What we have a lot in that slide and in other slides of the same training is that we have this does that, but we don't have an in context experience with a workflow, or actually we started doing those, but I'm still pushing very hard to change that, from this type of slide to actual, hey, what does it do when I do this, and when and why should I choose this? The why is not there. There is no why whatsoever. It's all about click button does A or B.
Right. Any comments or responses to what Claire said? I'm going to show you the next. She sent 2 slides. This one is getting more into step-by-step procedure, right?
Yes, so this one is actually part of a workflow.
Right. And I don't know if the one we saw before, if elements of that relate to this particular procedure, where that could be described at that time.
They can be part of the same workflow, but not at all next to each other. It's several steps apart.
Any comments or suggestions about this?
One of the things that I usually try to encourage is a playground. So instead of reading a series of steps, if we can have the actual participants go into the application and actually try. And generally speaking, instead of, I'm trying to encourage the learners to increase their self-efficacy. So see if they can come up with their own set of functionality or steps to complete something. So right now, internally, I'm working for a forestry company. And we have a logistics platform or application. We actually just asked our provider, and they're just building out a playground because they said it's been requested numerous times. And so in the training, instead of having people review slides and be a little bit more passive, it is you're already on the computer, open up the application, go through the process here. I'm going to give you a situation. You're trying to move X number of logs to Y. Let's go through, how would you go about it? And then work in teams. So there's a little bit of, collaboration occurring. We can talk it through and then, or create steps and using it that way, opposed to here's the steps, here's how we do it, A, B, and B, C. Just because I find that attention decreases if I'm just sitting there passively reading slides. My suggestion.
Jesse, go ahead, Claire.
Thank you. We actually do both. So we have the step-by-step parts, but we encourage the learner to have the software open on its end as well. We can't use a playground because our software evolves very quickly. Part of our marketing strategy is to be, I'm sorry, I forgot the English for that, state edge something, to be always permanent as one of the trailblazers in that. So it would create a massive amount of work to keep a playground up to date. However, what we do, we also have those tutorial files that we put in there. So once we've explained it, we give you those files with things to do so that you can do them yourself. But there's a caveat to that, so that we have those massive modules, and just like that one tutorial on what point. So I'm gonna let you figure out what's my issue with that.
So I think what we're seeing, you know, so much of what we do is constrained by the media and the technology and the resources that we have. But Jesse, you brought up an interesting issue with your description. There's been a lot of discussion about, is it better just to take a directive approach, which could be, you know, just to hear, you know, number one, select a mesh, and then you do that. That could be a little thing on the screen and the person does it. So it'd be very directive. And then the next one, select meshes with check boxes, and they do it. So they're getting engaged, but in a very directive way. Whereas what you described was a more of a somewhat discovery method. Maybe they had the, you know, step by step, or they were working it out as a group. Could you comment on that, Jesse?
Yeah, so it depends on where we are at the process or what part of the application we're working on.
Mhm.
And so I try and balance that. So part of it will be self discovery, where it's more situational or experiential. Here's what we're trying to accomplish with this application. So it's more as closely resembling to real world application, just so we can really look at and support performance in a close to real world situation. Other times, especially at the beginning, it is just getting familiar with the functionality. So it'll be open it up. Here's where you can go and select here. Actually, we have a place for FAQ. So if you need to go up and there's questions, here's how you can solve on your own. If FAQs aren't there, this is where you go. All right, here's the challenge. You're going to be into groups, and here's what you're going to have to do. And then depending, we have several different applications we're utilizing. One of them, I have them create their own process map. So they're kind of creating their own way of doing things, and then they compare. So, okay, I've created this, and then see what Ruth's created. Oh, I forgot that step. That's great. And we can go across and support one another in filling it out, but I'm putting things into my own words and context. So, so far it's been well received. The challenge is kind of clear to your point, is we want to put everything under the sun in there, and want to make sure we don't miss anything. I'm trying to move us away. Well, sometimes people come with pre-existing knowledge. They're coming from one of our competitors and are very we have similar applications. So the learning curve isn't as steep. So we don't need to inundate and bore individuals, so they can fill in their own gaps, and then have some additional job aids resources or a person they can reach out to if there's still gaps needed to be supported.
Thank you, Jesse. I think this is a challenge a lot of us face with software training. The general research in the cognitive load group is they would prefer, because of efficiency, if the people are new, they would prefer that you take a more directive approach. It's faster, there's less cognitive load. But what was really good about what you suggested is it does get people to start using the help functionality, which in normal training maybe we never do, so that later on down the road, they get stuck, they can, you know, have some familiarity with what that is. So a lot of trade-offs here. I have a question for everybody. What about the black background? This is a pretty basic question. Is that a good idea? Has anybody read that research on, you know, what the background should be? It seems to me somewhere eons ago, I read it's better to have a white background. Oh, the devs like it. Okay, better just for readability. Just for readability. But I think if we were redoing this, we'd make the screen large, the application screen, we'd put the little steps as call outs, and we'd ask the person to do it if technology would support all of that, and time. Yeah, not enough contrast with the blue font. I always had read it was better to have white and use colors, but I haven't read anything about it recently. Okay, thank you, Claire. And thanks for your comments. We had a real world context to look at. So in the beginning, in our first session, we talked about media mania. And what happens is people get a focus on the technology. We've got that, we're going to use it. As Rich Mayer says, just because you can do it, should you? Versus, are we really focusing on the learning? And in his research, and we're going to share a little bit of this, he recommends, rather than media comparison, like, is this better than a slide? Or is it better to read something versus see a video? It's going to be better to actually do value added research, which we'll look at here in just a minute. So I did want to summarize for you a little bit on the evidence on immersive virtual reality. Are any of you using immersive virtual reality or testing it in your context? Just put your answer in chat, because I don't think I can see everybody's face here. Anybody who's using immersive virtual reality. So isn't it true that, you know, we had Facebook and now they're Meta, and isn't their whole future premise here going to be, we're all going to be in these immersive environments? Is this something that, you know, is coming up and we all need to, you know, start getting prepared? Or it's going to be a passing fad? Is the metaverse going to take over? And will we use this for learning? Well, while you're reflecting on that, I'm going to share a couple of research pieces with you, and then we can talk more about, you know, the latest and greatest technologies as they come up. This was a media comparison study. The topic, as you can see, had to do with, I think, cells and blood cells and flowing of blood through the veins and arteries. And the one on the left, the students took it as an immersive virtual reality, so they could, you know, look all around and they could see the different, you know, cells coming along, and they could go into a cell and see the parts of a cell. And on the right, they got all this different group. They got all the same information, but it was in the form of a slideshow, basically. So then they tested learning on, you know, both of these. And if you want to use your marker tool, or you can use chat, where did they get better learning? I think I talked about this briefly earlier. I don't remember, but which one gave better learning? The slideshow or the immersive virtual reality? Okay, so we have maybe the same. Claire's voting for the slideshow, yes, as is Carrie. Let's see how this turned out. So you're absolutely right. The slideshow gave better results. This was a fairly recent experiment published in 2018. But here's the interesting part. They found, as far as rating the lesson, the learners loved the immersive virtual reality. They were happier, they were more excited, they were less bored compared to the slideshow group. So here we had a case of, you know, a lot more liking, but maybe not as good learning. So, oops, I wanted to go backwards. So this has been kind of a common theme. The students like it. What are some reasons you think they might have liked it better and they didn't learn as well? What are some reasons that you can think of for that? Yes, Julie, and that's what I thought too. And I didn't feel like they really brought that out very much in the research. Yes, the visual. So there was so much overload. Yes, seductive details, exactly. Because they could turn around and they could look at this in 360 degrees, which may not necessarily have been so relevant. And then maybe some of these students, they had done immersive things, or they just thought this was super exciting. So that's why, and they were engaged, apparently not totally productively, but so for all those reasons, they really liked it better. So this is kind of the trade-offs here. Another problem can be, apparently some people, I don't know if anybody's done immersive virtual reality yourself. Some people actually get sick, have a physical sickness from all that movement. So let's see. So there was a review done in Rich Mayer's book. They looked at 52 studies that compared immersive virtual reality to some other media. Maybe it was a video, maybe it was a slideshow. And they found, you looked at effect size, very, very small. It's almost negligible. And they found out of those 52, 31 showed better learning and 21 showed equivalent or lower learning. So I think we are at a point where we have to say, okay, if we're going to use this, what's the best way to use it? Yes, that's a good question about immediate versus long-term persistence. Unfortunately, a lot of experiments don't measure long-term learning, and that's something we should always look for when we're looking at the research. And I don't know that they did a delayed test. A delay is usually like a week later. It's still a delayed test. So that's the good point, for which I don't really have an answer. But what they've tried to do now is say, okay, they like this immersive virtual reality. What can we add to it, or how can we design it to make it more effective? And as somebody pointed out here in the chat, it may have had a lot of seductive visual information. So what they're suggesting, and they've done research on this, we need to reduce the load. And one thing they did using that same content about cells and blood flow, they did a pre-training. So one group took video, one group took the immersive video, and then they either had pre-training or they had no pre-training. I wanted to just show you. This pre-training was so simple. So it was just a slide where they looked at, what a cell might look like. And then they compared pre-training to no pre-training, watching it on a video versus watching it in the immersive environment. So here were the results, and this was transfer learning. So go back to the point that we raised before. So looking at this, how do you interpret this results? What would you say? This is transfer learning.
To me, it looks like for the virtual reality, the pre-training makes a significant difference, but for video, the pre-training doesn't seem to make much of a difference.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I think what they're arguing is that if you're going to use immersive virtual reality because they really like it, you can improve the results by giving people, some background information about the concepts prior to the virtual reality. I actually wanted to go backwards. Let's try this again. So that was one point they made. The second thing is, if you're going to use immersive virtual reality, you can segment the content down, pause it periodically, and ask them some activity to summarize what they learned. So it's basically a chunking strategy. So people are not so overwhelmed by all the content and the visual information at once. So where the research is going is, not is immersive virtual reality better or worse, but how can we actually get better results from it? And I was impressed how simple this pre-training is in this case. This was another, after one habituates. Yes, that's a real good question, Rich, because I think that in this case, well, for most all these students, it was a relatively new technology, right? And they thought it was really cool. Yeah, so what happens after one habituates? And it will be interesting if we all get into the metaverse, which our colleagues maybe would want. Will that make a difference as far as what experience you have, what expectations you have, and the learning from it? So I think that's a really good question. Yes, yes, there you go, Matt. Actually, do any of you remember what was that app? What was that thing that they had about 10 years ago? It was going to revolutionize the world. We all had an avatar. We were going to go, thank you. Yeah, Second Life. Whatever happened to Second Life? I don't see it anywhere. So it's just another example maybe of how people get overly enthusiastic about media. This was an interesting study. The focus was climate control, and the students, they went to Greenland and they could actually do a fast forward. They could see how the glaciers were melting. They could take samples. It was very interactive. And the video group, they just watched a video of one person going through all this. So they were not actually engaged themselves. They were just watching what one person did. And what they found is that learning was just as good with the video group as with the virtual field trip group, but they did like it better And so the question also is, when does it make sense to actually use this? Thank you, Jesse. You can check in on the recording later when we're going to talk about games. Okay. So when does it make sense to actually consider this? And maybe, like in this case, kids aren't going to get to go to Greenland and do these kind of experiments. So maybe in situations like safety, where it might be too expensive or dangerous or impossible to do in the real world. So what do you guys think in terms of how you might use this in the future?
I have there's something in that sentence that bugs me. Uh, if it is impossible in real world, then what's the outcome that we want for this training?
Well, that's a real good question. And I think here, and it was interesting because they did check this by being able to do like a simulated experience and see what's happening in Greenland. The outcome they would hope for is higher motivation and a greater commitment to climate control in this particular case. So would you get a greater, and it would be interesting then to watch the behaviors or reactions of people after they had the immersive experience to see if they had a greater emotional and behavioral commitment to the point of it.
I would really be interested to know as well, because VR is so new compared to videos, to what extent the simulation used was built out in terms of audio and like what sounds they were played, whether there was narration, because I think all these things can play a factor into how like impactful it is long term, where their key phrases being told to people while they were exploring, like, are those things comparative elements or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the experiment actually, it was a whole class. And so they had some kind of traditional didactic learning prior to going into this immersive experience. So it was just part of a bigger picture because all of those are relevant points. I'm going to take a few minutes. We're getting up close to the hour. I'm so happy Rich also wrote this chapter on game-based learning. And we talked about this example previously. In this game, they were trying to learn about wet cell batteries and they had the information, but they had to go through this bunker and they had to do different actions to to get through the bunker and to also learn about wet cell batteries. And they found out, as we talked about before, people actually learn better with slides, probably because of too much extraneous load and a lot of irrelevant activities you had to do in this game. So what Rich Mayer is now looking at is what we call value added research. So you have a game and then you improve that game, just as we just saw with the immersive virtual reality. They improved it with a pre-training. So what could we do with a game? What could we add to make it more effective? So here's a couple of examples of what he did. His game had to do with electric circuits. And this is just a slide from the game. You had to drag and drop, and then you got so many points and there were different levels, etc. You had to drag and drop these elements to make the current bigger or smaller or whatever. So this is one thing he did. They added this little feedback box. So after you responded, it gave you a little information, a little explanation. And they found out that actually improved learning a lot, just that simple feedback. And they showed you what was the right answer and the explanation. Another thing they did, if you look at the box on the right, here they were going for self-explanations. So if you take an action, what are the reasons that you think your particular alteration to this circuit, what are the different reasons that it was more effective? And they found out that, that was a big improvement. So adding things to games that make them more educational or learning relevant is where the research is going now. And we're just starting to make a list of what some of those things might be. This is such an interesting area on cognitive consequences, which is if you play, like I have grandsons and they play hours on video games, does that actually improve their aptitudes or their mental skills? So you have one group that to play the game and the other one does not, and then you look at a cognitive test. So this is one game that Rich Mayer and his colleagues, they developed. And it's a game that focuses on switching attention. So in the beginning, you have to shoot up either food or liquid to these aliens. And you have a simple rule. Like in this one, we see the red ones are thirsty and the blue ones are hungry. But then after a little bit of this, and if you get it right, then they turn into points. And if you get it wrong, they crash down and you lose points. But then after this, they say one-eyed aliens are thirsty and two-eyed aliens are hungry. So the rules keep switching. And as the levels go on, they have more and more complexity. And so the question is, would this actually improve, your mental abilities? And they found out that in fact, it did help on the focus of attention. They got 2 hours of playing that game, gave a better executive skill of, attention. And he came up with these 6 features that make games effective, which is have a short game, very focused, lots of practice, give feedback, have levels so the challenge increases, have variation in the games so you get transfer, and of course it should be fun. So has anybody here actually done or embedded games into their instruction, and what has been your experience? In what context? So they had, Rich, they had actually, and there's a whole set of cognitive skills, and they just ask people to do these different tasks, which vary as far as how you have to deploy your attention. So it's a generic test that they have used for that. So any comments or observations about games?
Ruth, so like the one that you shared, I mean, the objective seems to be about increasing my sort of cognitive attention. Is that
Right.
what it is? So like, my company just recently put out one on cybersecurity, which like all it was different types of like personal identifiable information was like falling from the sky, and then I had to move and say like which ones were dangerous or not. So like I guess the game added a little bit of novelty, but I don't think it enhanced my learning and identifying which things were needed to be more secure versus others that a simple multiple choice or like true false question would have. So to me, it feels like it also depends on, again, what the outcome is, and if you're designing a game just for the purpose of novelty versus what your learning outcome needs to be.
Good example, Julie. And in your case, was there a time factor? In other words, these things were falling and you had to, so there have been research on things like that. And maybe the time factor, though, is irrelevant to the task. So people have to respond quickly, which could defeat the learning. But I think the idea might be okay, but you could have them on there and they could drag and drop them, but not fast. Does that make
And
sense?
like, yeah, some of them fell faster than others, and like they fell faster than I could move my like cursor to get over there because I was all the way over here. So it just also added a little bit of like annoyance and frustration because I wasn't getting points when I knew what the answer was.
Right. Yeah, I
Mhm.
think that's a good example of maybe not the best design. I think you could make a game out of that, but with different design features. Certainly time pressure is not relevant in your case. In some tasks, time is an important issue, but it sounds like at yours it wasn't so much. I wanted to give you a quick summary of, there's a lot we don't know. So somebody posted, Claire, I think it was you, a story. So we don't have consistent research on narrative themes. It sounds like you're creating a narrative theme with a story, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. So at the end of each of our chapters, we have a list of what we don't know. We don't know about competition. We don't know, is it a good idea to choose a character and choose your own background? What's the best way to integrate games? And are certain learners' objectives and content more effective? So there's a lot of stuff we don't know from a research perspective about games. But you know what I always said, I don't know, so I'm going to try this. It makes sense. And the research only tells me so much, so I'm going to move forward with what I think is right. And that's, to me, the take home for all of this. We we apply evidence-based principles, but then the evidence only goes so far. And then beyond that, we do our best judgment. Thanks for that example, Julia. It was great. Great. I'm going to kind of wind up here because we are running out of time. This is just kind of a slide that encaptures some of the major topics that we pretty quickly run through. And I just want everyone, if you just take a minute to chat, which of any of these was helpful or useful that you're going to be able to apply in the future. You can use audio or you can use chat.
I'm gonna think more about self-explanations and how to incorporate that more into learning, given how impactful that seems to be.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And we showed them in the context of examples, but you could use them for anything. Like if you had graphics or anything you have, you could use them. That's a great application. What others? Signaling. Yeah, Heather, I always thought signaling was intuitive, but really, I think emphasis signaling is intuitive, but other types of signaling were not. And I really learned a lot going through that research. Generative. So generative is critical, where we get learners engaged in a productive way.
I want to
Okay.
think more creatively about the generative activities that we discussed before, how challenging it is to do a self-explanation through an e-learning, but maybe with some creative thinking can find a way to do that. And even in face-to-face, like, I've suggested an activity around explaining to others or journaling, and my colleagues aren't excited about it. Doesn't seem sexy enough.
Yeah, that's a barrier sometime. And while you're talking about your examples, I need examples for the book. So if any of you have something to donate or to send, just contact me, because I'm making a list of the kind of examples. Like I mentioned, all of our synchronous or asynchronous examples are outdated as far as the technology. So I need new ones. So follow up with me in email if you have anything that is not proprietary and it could be shared with other people. So the book, it will hopefully be out maybe by the end of next year. One of the things I'll say for Matt, they have their own, LDA has their own publishing process, which I think will be much more efficient. Because we did all of these with Wiley, we're publishing with Wiley, but it's a very slow, clunky process. Part of the slowness is just us as far as writing is concerned, but then they're going to edit it. And then when you get it back, the figures often aren't in a good place for the text. You have to redo it. So it's a slow process. So I want to thank everybody for your being here and your participation, and turn it over to Matt for last words of wisdom.
I have no wisdom and few words. Just if you don't remember, please do join us for our networking tomorrow. I'll turn off the recording. I know Ruth